imagine the darkness.
Not the comfortable kind of darkness that falls gently over a sleeping city. Not the soft, star-flecked dark of a summer night in the countryside. This darkness was alive. It moved, it howled, it swallowed men whole. Picture the Sea of Galilee, a body of water that on any calm morning looks like hammered silver under a rising sun, still and merciful, almost holy. The kind of water that makes fishermen forget every storm they've ever survived. The kind of beauty that makes you believe the world is good and the universe is kind. But not tonight. Tonight, the Sea of Galilee is unrecognizable. The water has turned the color of charcoal and ash. The waves are no longer gentle swells. They are walls, 8 feet high, 10 feet, crashing into each other with the force of something ancient and enraged, as if the water itself is furious at the very existence of the small wooden vessel caught in the middle of it all. Inside that boat are 12 men. No, wait. By the time this story reaches its turning point, there are only 11 men in that boat. The 12th one is standing on the water, not sinking, not swimming, standing, upright, walking across the surface of a storm-shattered sea as calmly as a man walking across a marble floor in the temple courts of Jerusalem. And here is the question that has haunted theologians, historians, skeptics, and believers for 2,000 years. Was it really happening? And deeper than that, darker than that, more terrifying than the storm itself. Why did the man who stepped out of the boat to meet him start to sink? What happens to faith when the miracle is happening right in front of you and your feet are still going under? What does it mean to believe something with your whole heart and still drown? That is the story we are about to enter. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never read the words, "O ye of little faith," the same way again. To understand what happened on that water, you have to understand the world these men came from. The year is roughly 29 AD. The region is Galilee, a rugged, sun-bleached stretch of northern Israel, populated by farmers, fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary people living ordinary, difficult lives under the thumb of the Roman Empire. These were not soft men. The disciples of Jesus, and Simon Peter in particular, were men shaped by labor, by loss, by the particular hardness that comes from growing up poor in an occupied country. They had calloused hands and wind-burned faces. They knew the smell of fish guts and boat tar and salt water. They knew hunger. They knew the particular humiliation of watching Roman soldiers patrol streets that used to belong to their fathers. Peter, whose name was originally Simon, before Jesus renamed him, was a fisherman from the town of Bethsaida on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. He was, by every account, a big man, loud, passionate, the kind of person who filled up a room just by walking into it. He had a voice like a breaking wave and a temper to match. I was the first one to speak in any situation and the first one to act on impulse. I was also, if we're being completely honest, deeply insecure. That insecurity, that desperate, burning need to prove himself, is one of the most important things to understand about Peter. Because it was that quality, more than anything else, that drove him to step out of the boat on that terrible night. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning of this particular day, because what happened before the storm matters enormously to what happened during it. It had been an extraordinary afternoon. Jesus had just performed one of the most staggering public miracles of his entire ministry. The feeding of the 5,000. 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish, blessed and broken and distributed by the disciples, had somehow fed a crowd of at least 5,000 men, plus women and children. The actual number was probably closer to 15 or 20,000 people. Think about that for a moment. 20,000 people had just watched the impossible happen. They had felt the bread in their hands. They had tasted it. They had watched the baskets come back full again and again when logic and arithmetic said they should have run out after the first 100 people. The atmosphere was electric. You know the feeling in a stadium when something extraordinary happens, when a game-winning play unfolds and the crowd erupts in a single primal roar. Multiply that by every spiritual longing every person in that crowd had ever felt in their entire life. Multiply it by the specific hunger of a people who had been waiting for a deliverer for 400 years. That is what it felt like. The crowd was beginning to murmur. Then the murmur became voices. Then the voices became a rising chant. They were talking about making Jesus king. Right here, right now, by force, if necessary. They had seen enough. No prophet could do what they had just witnessed unless God himself was behind it. And if God was behind it, then why wait? Why not march on Jerusalem tonight?
Why not tear down every Roman banner and reclaim the holy city?
The disciples heard this too. And here is where it gets psychologically fascinating, because the disciples themselves were not immune to this energy. These were men who had followed Jesus for months, who had heard his teachings about a spiritual kingdom, about servant leadership, about the first being last, and yet some part of them, especially Peter, was still gripped by the older dream, the dream of a Messiah who would rule with military power, the dream of thrones and crowns and earthly vindication. Standing there in the buzzing aftermath of a miracle, watching 20,000 people ready to crown your teacher king. That dream must have felt very, very close. And then Jesus did something that shocked everyone. He left, not gradually, not slowly. He withdrew. He sent the disciples away, dismissed the crowd, and went up alone into the hills to pray. No explanation, no ceremony, just gone. The disciples, following his instruction, climbed into their boat and pushed off from shore, heading across the Sea of Galilee toward the town of Capernaum on the other side. The sky behind them was still warm with evening. The water was calm. They had no idea what the night had in store for them, and somewhere on that hillside, alone in the gathering dark, Jesus was already watching. If this opening has gripped you, if you feel the weight of this story settling over you, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and join a community of people who love diving deep into the greatest stories ever told. The next story we share might be the one that changes everything for you. It comes without warning. That is the thing about storms on the Sea of Galilee. And this is not poetic license. This is documented meteorological reality. The Sea of Galilee sits in a basin surrounded by hills, and those hills act like a funnel for the winds that whip across the Syrian plateau to the north and east. A clear evening can become a terrifying storm within minutes. Fishermen who have worked those waters their whole lives still speak of it with something close to reverence. One moment, the water is glass. The next, it is trying to kill you. The disciples had been rowing for hours by the time the storm hit. Matthew's gospel tells us it was already the fourth watch of the night, between 3 and 6 in the morning, which means they had been struggling against wind and waves in the dark for at least 6 or 7 hours. They were exhausted. Their muscles burned. Their hands were raw. The boat was taking water, and they were getting nowhere. This is the detail that tends to get glossed over in casual retellings, but it matters intensely to the psychological reality of this moment. They had been fighting this storm for most of the night. They had not slept. They were likely terrified, even Peter, even the experienced fishermen among them, because this was not a manageable storm. This was the kind of storm that kills people, the kind that shows up in nightmares afterward, years later. There is a specific quality to exhaustion and fear that strips away everything false. When you have been fighting for your life for 6 hours in the dark, you stop performing. You stop pretending. Whatever is actually inside you, whatever you actually believe, whatever you actually trust, that is what comes to the surface. And what comes to the surface for the disciples, somewhere in the darkest part of that night, is something very close to despair. There is no shore in sight. The lights from Capernaum, if they can even see them through the spray and the darkness, might as well be on the other side of the world. The wind is fighting them with what feels like personal malice. Every wave that crashes over the bow knocks them back. They are strong men, skilled men, and they are losing. And then someone sees it. We don't know who saw it first. The Gospels don't tell us that. What they tell us is the collective reaction. They were terrified. The Greek word used in Matthew's account is etarakthesan, to be agitated, to be thrown into confusion, to be shaken to the core. They thought they were seeing a ghost. Think about what that means. These men had just witnessed the feeding of 5,000 people. They had seen Jesus heal the sick, cast out demons, raise the dead. They had spent months in close personal relationship with a man who seemed to carry the power of the universe in the palms of his hands. And when they see a figure walking toward them across the surface of an active storm, their first instinct is not, "Oh, it's Jesus." Their first instinct is terror. Because here is the truth about miracles. And here is the truth that this story refuses to let us ignore. Witnessing a miracle does not automatically produce lasting, sturdy faith. Experiencing something supernatural does not permanently rewire the human heart. The disciples had seen miracle after miracle, and still, in this moment, in the dark, in the storm, in their exhaustion, they could not see clearly. They could not recognize the one person in all the universe who would never harm them. They cried out in fear, and across the churning water, through the howling wind, a voice cut through everything. "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." 3 sentences. 11 words. But listen to what those 11 words contain. Take courage. This is a command, not a comfort. It assumes the courage must be chosen. It assumes you have to reach for it deliberately, even when every nerve in your body is screaming the opposite. It is I. The Greek is ego eimi, which is, quite literally, I am. The same phrase God used when Moses asked for his name at the burning bush. This was not an accident. This was a declaration. Don't be afraid. Another command. Another act of will required. In 3 short sentences, Jesus told the disciples everything they needed to know. But one man heard something else. One man heard something more. One man heard an invitation. Peter, of course it was Peter, out of 12 exhausted, terrified men, clinging to a waterlogged boat in the middle of a night storm, only one of them called back across the water. Only one of them looked at that figure, that impossible figure, walking calmly through the waves, and thought not, how do I make this stop, but how do I get closer? That is either the purest expression of faith in the entire New Testament, or the most reckless act of ego ever witnessed on the Sea of Galilee. Probably both. Lord, Peter shouts. And you can hear in this word everything he is feeling. The doubt, the longing, the desperate hope. If it is you, tell me to come to you on the water. If it is you. Let that phrase settle for a moment. Peter had heard the voice. He had heard, it is I. He had heard the divine declaration, the echo of the burning bush. And still he said, if. This is not a failure of faith. This is the most human possible response to the impossible. We want to believe. We are desperate to believe. But the mind keeps reaching for certainty, keeps looking for one more confirmation, keeps saying, tell me one more time. Show me one more sign. Let me be absolutely sure before I step out into the nothing. And here is what Jesus said back to him.
One word!
Come, not I'll prove it to you. Not, here is the theological foundation for why this is real. Not a long explanation, not a reassurance, not a safety net. Just come. And Peter got out of the boat. Stop. Just stop and sit with that for a second. Because we have heard this story so many times that we have lost the ability to feel the sheer, staggering magnitude of what he did. The boat was real. The storm was real. The waves were real. 10 feet high, crashing, foam white in the darkness. The water was cold. The wind was a wall of force pushing against any attempt to stand upright. And Peter put his foot over the edge of the boat and stepped onto the surface of a raging sea. And it held him for one extraordinary, heart-stopping, cosmos-rearranging moment. Simon Peter, fisherman, loudmouth, impulsive, deeply insecure, Simon Peter walked on water. Imagine what that felt like. Imagine the first step, the water firm and solid beneath his foot, when every fiber of his physical experience told him it should not be. Imagine the second step. Imagine looking down and seeing the dark water churned white with foam directly below you, and feeling it support your weight like solid ground. Imagine looking up and seeing Jesus, actually seeing Jesus, close now, the face coming clear through the spray and wind, and knowing with your whole body and mind and soul that something beyond nature is happening and you are in the middle of it. For that moment, Peter was the only human being in history besides Jesus himself to walk on water. And then he noticed the wind. This is the heart of it. This is the part of the story that has wrecked more people's comfortable theology than almost any other single moment in the New Testament, because it refuses to let faith be simple. Peter was already on the water. The miracle was already happening. Jesus was right there, close, visible, real. And yet, the moment Peter shifted his attention from Jesus to the wind, the moment he looked around at the storm instead of forward at the one who had called him, he began to sink. Not immediately, not all at once. Matthew uses the word katapantinomai, to go down deeply into the sea, to plunge. As if the water that had been holding him up suddenly remembered its own nature and reasserted itself. Peter began to sink, and he cried out. That shout that has echoed through 2,000 years of human faith and failure. Lord, save me! 3 words. The briefest, most desperate prayer in all of Scripture. And immediately, that word immediately matters. Mark uses it constantly, and Matthew echoes it here. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Before Peter went under, before the water closed over his head, before the storm won, Jesus caught him. And then came the question that cuts, the question that Jesus asked while they were both standing on the water in the middle of a storm, the question he could have saved for the shore, the question he could have softened or delayed or wrapped in gentler words. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? For 2,000 years, that question has been leveled at Peter like an accusation, and for 2,000 years, readers of this story have felt a complicated mixture of sympathy and judgment. We sympathize with Peter because we know we would have done the same thing. We judge him because we expect better of someone who had walked on water for 30 seconds. But I want to suggest something different. I want to suggest that Jesus was not rebuking Peter for being human. He was not expressing disappointment exactly. He was asking a genuine question, the most important question, the question that Peter needed to carry with him for the rest of his life. Why did you doubt? Not how dare you doubt. Not you ruined everything. Not I am finished with you. Why? Because the why matters. The answer to the why is where the transformation lives. Peter did not doubt because he was weak. He did not doubt because he lacked conviction. He did not doubt because he did not love Jesus. He doubted because he allowed the reality of the storm to become more real to him than the reality of the one who had called him onto the water. He shifted his gaze, and the moment his gaze shifted, his faith, which had been doing the impossible, began to fail. Now, here is where this gets uncomfortably personal. Because all of us, every single person watching this right now, has stood in some version of Peter's place. You have felt the ground of faith solid beneath you. You have had the moment of clarity, the moment of trust, the moment where you step out in response to a calling you cannot fully explain. And then the wind comes, the diagnosis, the job loss, the relationship collapse, the depression, the grief, the long silence where you prayed, and prayed and heard nothing back. And you feel the water begin to give way beneath you, and you cry out, or you want to, even if you feel too proud, or too wounded, or too exhausted to form the words, "Lord, save me." This story exists in part to tell you what happens next. If you've been in that place, if you've felt yourself sinking, comment below. You are not alone. And the hand that reached for Peter reaches for you too. Let's go deeper into this man because he deserves it. Simon Peter is arguably the most complex character in the entire New Testament. Not the most theologically profound, that is probably Paul, not the most poetic, that is John, but Peter is the most human, the most recognizable, the most relentlessly, painfully, gloriously human. I was born in Bethsaida, raised in a fishing culture that valued strength, loyalty, and directness. He was the kind of man who wore his heart completely on the outside. What he felt, he said. What he believed, he acted on. There was very little calculation in Peter, and that was both his greatest strength and his most catastrophic flaw. We know from Scripture that Peter was married. There is a reference to his mother-in-law, whom Jesus healed early in his ministry. We know he had a brother, Andrew, who was also a disciple, and who was the one who first introduced Peter to Jesus. We know he had a business, a fishing operation on the Sea of Galilee that apparently involved hired servants, which means he was not desperately poor, but rather a working-class success story by the standards of first-century Galilee. He gave all of that up to follow Jesus. That is not a small thing. That is not a casual decision. That is the kind of decision that changes every relationship, every obligation, every financial arrangement, every plan you have ever made for your future. Peter left behind a working life, a home, a community, everything that had defined him, to follow a teacher from Nazareth. Why? What did he see in Jesus that compelled that kind of abandonment? We get a glimpse early in the Gospels. When Jesus first called Peter and Andrew, he was standing on the shore while Peter and his crew had spent all night fishing and caught nothing. Jesus told them to put their nets into the deep water. Peter protested. They were professionals. They had tried everything. It was pointless. But he did it anyway. The nets came back so full they began to tear. Both boats filled with fish and started to sink under the weight. And Peter, instead of celebrating, fell to his knees in the boat and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." That is a remarkable response to a miracle. Not excitement, not wonder exactly, or not only wonder, but recognition. A sudden, scalding awareness of his own inadequacy in the presence of something holy. This is the pattern of genuine encounter with the divine in Scripture, from Isaiah crying out, "Woe is me, I am undone," to John falling as though dead when he sees the risen Christ in the book of Revelation. Peter felt it the first time he met Jesus, and Jesus looked at him, this rough, loud, insecure, brilliant, impulsive fisherman kneeling in a boat full of fish, and said, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." From now on. Everything before this was prologue. Everything before this was preparation. Peter got up and followed Jesus. And he never stopped following. Even when he stumbled, even when he sank, even when later In the most devastating failure of his life, he would deny ever knowing Jesus 3 times by a charcoal fire in the cold hours of a different dark night. He always found his way back. That is the arc of Peter's life. Not a smooth upward trajectory of faith. A wild, careening, water-walking, wave-sinking, 3-time denying, rooster-crowing, ultimately glorious zigzag toward the man he was called to become. And it all runs through this one night on the Sea of Galilee. Let's not forget the rest of them. While Peter was out there on the water, sinking, rescued, walking back to the boat in the grip of Jesus' hand, 11 other men were watching from inside the boat. What were they feeling? We don't know for certain. The Gospels don't linger on their inner experience in this moment, but we can reasonably imagine it. Some of them probably felt relief that they had stayed in the boat. Some of them probably felt a complicated mix of awe and envy as they watched Peter do what none of them had dared to do. Some of them may have felt shame, that private stinging shame of recognizing your own fear in the failure of someone braver than you. And some of them, at least a few, probably felt the first stirrings of something that would grow into an unshakable conviction that the man walking toward their boat on the surface of the storm was not simply a teacher, not simply a prophet, not simply a wonder worker, but something else entirely. Something that did not have a category yet in their theological vocabulary. Because when Jesus and Peter climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Just like that. Mid-howl. Mid-rage. The storm that had been battering them for hours simply ceased. As if someone had reached out and turned off the sound. As if the entire cosmos had exhaled. The water flattened. The waves settled. The night, which moments before had felt like the end of everything, became suddenly, almost absurdly, calm. And the 11 men in that boat did something they apparently had not done, even after the feeding of 5,000, even after the healings, even after the casting out of demons. They worshipped him, right there in the boat, soaking wet and exhausted and trembling, with something beyond fear. They bowed before him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Not a teacher, not a prophet, not a king in the political sense they had been hoping for. The Son of God. This is a massive moment in the gospel narrative, and it tends to get overshadowed by the drama of Peter sinking and being caught. But what happened in that boat after the storm stopped is the theological climax of the entire episode, because it marks a turning point in the disciples' understanding of who they were actually following. They had known he was special. They had known he was extraordinary. But special and extraordinary are categories that human beings can occupy. Son of God is something else, something that changes everything. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep exploring these moments that changed everything, but not just for the disciples, but for the entire world. Every story we tell is a doorway into something deeper. I want to spend some time with a question that doesn't get asked often enough. What was Peter doing right? Because the traditional reading of this story tends to focus almost entirely on his failure. He doubted, he sank, he was rebuked. And that reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And an incomplete reading of this story can do real spiritual damage, because it can teach people that stepping out in faith is dangerous, that boldness is punished, that the safest thing is to stay in the boat. But that is precisely backwards. Look at what Peter got right. He got out of the boat. 11 other men. 11 men who also loved Jesus, who also believed in Jesus, who also had been eyewitnesses to miracle after miracle, stayed in the boat. They were not rebuked. Nobody called them out by name. Nobody asked why they didn't come. And yet none of them walked on water that night. Only Peter, because Peter asked. Because Peter said, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come." Because Peter received the invitation and acted on it immediately, without overthinking, without consulting the other 11, without waiting for more favorable conditions. And he walked on water. That is not a small thing to gloss over in our rush to get to the sinking part. Peter walked on water. For a few extraordinary seconds, a human being did something that the laws of physics declare impossible, and he did it because he trusted the word of Jesus more than he trusted what his eyes and common sense told him about the nature of water and gravity and storms. The failure, the sinking, came after the success, not before it. Peter did not sink on the way out. He sank on the way back when his focus shifted. And even then, even in the sinking, something remarkable happened. He cried out to Jesus, not to the other disciples, not to God in some abstract, untested way. He cried out to Jesus specifically, personally, urgently, "Lord, save me." And that cry was itself an act of faith. Because in the moment when everything had gone wrong, when the miracle had failed and the water was claiming him, Peter still knew where to look. He still knew whose name to call. There is a kind of faith that only shows itself in the sinking. It is not the triumphant, walking on water faith that we love to celebrate. It is the raw, desperate, going under faith that has nothing left to offer except its own honesty. The faith that says, "I cannot save myself. I know I cannot save myself, and I know who can." That kind of faith, Scripture seems to suggest, is not a lesser faith. It might be the deepest faith of all. Here is something the story doesn't say explicitly, but that the full arc of Peter's life makes impossible to ignore. The storm on the Sea of Galilee was not just a weather event. It was a preview. For all his courage and passion, Peter was heading toward the darkest moment of his life. A moment more terrifying, in its own way, than any storm. A night when another kind of wind, the cold wind of fear, of exposure, of self-preservation, would strip away everything he thought he knew about himself and leave him weeping in the darkness with the sound of a rooster still ringing in his ears. The night of Jesus' arrest, the high priest's courtyard, the charcoal fire, the servant girl's question, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" "I am not." 3 times. If the storm on the Sea of Galilee was Peter sinking in water, the night of the denial was Peter sinking in something far deeper and colder. The sinking that happens inside the soul when you have betrayed the most important relationship of your life. And here is where the water walking story becomes almost unbearably poignant. Because when Jesus asked Peter, "Why did you doubt?" he was not just asking about that one night. He was preparing Peter for every storm to come. He was giving Peter a template, a muscle memory, a lesson to reach back for when the darkness came again, and the water rose again, and the wind became overwhelming again. The lesson was not, don't step out of the boat. The lesson was, don't look away from me. Keep your eyes on me. Even in the sinking, even in the failure. Keep your eyes on me, and the hand that reached into the water on the Sea of Galilee will reach for you again. No matter how deep you go, no matter what you have done, no matter how far the wind has taken you from shore. Peter needed to hear that lesson. He hadn't fully learned it yet. Not on that night on the water. He wouldn't fully learn it until after the resurrection, until that other lakeside moment when Jesus met him again on the shore of the same Sea of Galilee and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Once for each denial, a redemption precisely calibrated to the shape of the wound. But the seed was planted on the water, and seeds planted in the middle of storms sometimes take root more deeply than seeds planted in easy soil. Every great biblical story is also a mirror. It shows us ourselves, not in a comfortable, flattering way, but in the way that only honest reflection can, showing both what we are and what we might become. The story of Peter walking on water and sinking is one of the most universal mirrors in all of Scripture. Who among us has not stepped out in faith in some area of life, felt the first exhilarating moments of supernatural support, and then felt the wind come and watched the ground give way? Who among us has not cried, "Lord, save me," or wanted to, even if we couldn't find the words? Who among us has not heard, in some deep interior place, the question, "Why did you doubt?" And who among us has not struggled to answer it honestly? The storm in your life might look nothing like the Sea of Galilee. It might be a medical diagnosis that shattered your sense of security. It might be the slow collapse of a marriage you thought was solid. It might be the death of someone you loved, who you prayed for, desperately, specifically, with everything you had, and they died anyway. And the faith that had felt so solid began to crack and let in water. It might be the quiet kind of sinking, not dramatic, not sudden, just the gradual realization over months or years that you are farther from shore than you intended to get, and you don't remember exactly when the drifting started. Or maybe your storm is internal. Maybe it is depression or addiction or the crushing weight of shame for something you have done. Maybe it is the terrifying feeling that you have gone too far, sunk too deep, cried out too late, that the hand won't reach, that you are beyond rescuing. Peter's story says otherwise. Peter, who doubted in the middle of a miracle, who sank in the middle of a water walk, who would later deny Jesus 3 times, who would later abandon his calling and go back to fishing after the crucifixion. Peter ended up becoming exactly what his new name promised. Peter means rock, the foundation, the one upon whom the church would be built, not because he never sank, but because every time he sank, he cried out to the right name. And every time he cried out, the hand came. That is the promise written into this story. Not that the storm will never come. Not that the water will always hold. But that the hand is always there. Always reaching. Always faster than the sinking. If this story is speaking to you right now, If you're in a storm and you needed to hear this today, please leave a comment below. Your story matters. Your faith matters. And you are not walking through this alone. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that the Sea of Galilee still exists. The ancient world that Peter knew. Rome, Jerusalem, the temple courts, the roads walked by the disciples. Most of it is gone. Rome fell. The temple was destroyed. Cities crumbled. Empires rose and collapsed. But the Sea of Galilee is still there. It is still called, in Hebrew, the Kinneret, a word that means something like harp because of the distinctive shape of its shoreline. It still sits in that same geological basin, surrounded by those same hills that funnel the wind. It still experiences sudden, violent storms that rise without warning and subside just as quickly. Fishermen still work those waters. Pilgrims from every nation on earth come to stand on its shore, to look out across the water in the early morning, when the light is low and the surface is still, and to try to imagine what it looked like on that particular night. The darkness, the waves, the walking figure, the desperate man going under. And something about standing there, looking at that real body of water in the real world, tends to make the story feel different, not more mythological, more real. Because it happened on actual water, in an actual storm, to actual human beings who were afraid and exhausted and full of doubt, and still somehow encountered something that rewrote everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. That has to mean something. The fact that Jesus didn't choose to reveal himself in a quiet room, in calm conditions, in comfortable circumstances, but in the middle of a storm, in the darkest watch of the night, on churning water, to men who were terrified and near the end of their strength. That is not an accident. The darkness of our lives is not an obstacle to encounter with the divine. Sometimes it is the very condition in which it happens. There is a detail in this story that I have saved for this moment, because I think it is the most provocative thing in the entire episode. Jesus never answered Peter's if. When Peter said, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come," Jesus didn't say, "Yes, it's me. I promise. Here's my identification. Here's your guarantee." He just said, "Come." He called Peter forward without resolving the uncertainty. He invited Peter into action before Peter's doubts were settled. He asked Peter to move while "if" was still ringing in the air. And this, I believe, is one of the most honestly, almost uncomfortably true things in all of Scripture about the nature of faith. Faith does not require the removal of uncertainty before action. Faith is what happens when you act in the presence of uncertainty. The "if" is part of the story. It doesn't disqualify Peter. It doesn't make his water walking less real. The "if" is honest, and Jesus honored it. Not by removing it, but by saying "come," and letting what happened next answer it. You walked on water, Peter. That's your answer. And when you doubted and sank, I was right there. That's also your answer. The "if" gets answered in the experience of coming, not before. Let's talk about the ending, because the way this story ends matters enormously, and it tends to be the most underappreciated part. When Jesus and Peter climbed back into the boat, and the wind stopped, and the disciples worshipped. Matthew tells us that they arrived at Gennesaret. The storm was over. The crossing was complete.
They made it.
All of them. The ones who stayed in the boat, the one who got out and sank, the one who walked on water, they all arrived at the other shore. The storm did not prevent them from reaching their destination. It only made the journey more difficult, more terrifying, more costly. But they arrived. And they arrived with something they did not have when they set out: a deeper, more grounded, more tested understanding of who was in the boat with them. That is often how it works with faith. The storms don't take you off course. They reveal what is in the boat. They reveal what is in you. They strip away the easy confidence that comes from fair weather and force you to encounter the real weight of what you believe and what you don't quite believe yet. Peter arrived at Gennesaret knowing something he hadn't known before. He knew what it felt like to walk on water. He knew what it felt like to sink. He knew what it felt like to be caught by a hand that reached faster than the water could claim him. He would need all three of those knowings in the years to come. The theologian Helmut Thielicke once wrote that the Bible is not a book of answers. It is a book of encounters. I was right. This story is not a theological treatise on the mechanics of miracles. It is not a manual for how to increase your faith so you can walk on water. It is not a success story about what happens when you believe hard enough. It is an encounter between a storm and a savior. An encounter between fear and a voice that says, "Do not be afraid." An encounter between a sinking man and an outstretched hand. An encounter between doubt and the word, "Come." And like all real encounters, it leaves you changed, not necessarily more confident, not necessarily with all your questions answered, not necessarily without scars, but changed. Peter was changed by this night. He carried the memory of those steps on the water and the memory of the sinking for the rest of his life. We can see the fingerprints of this experience all through his letters. In the first epistle that bears his name, where he writes to communities facing persecution and tells them, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you."
He cares for you.
That is not abstract theology. That is a man writing from personal experience. That is a man who knows what it is to be caught by the hand of the one who cares. That is a man who sank and was not abandoned.
He cares for you.
If that phrase means something to you right now, if you needed to hear that today, leave an amen in the comments. Let's remind each other that we are not in these storms alone. I want to end where we began. The darkness. The waves, the figure walking through the storm. But I want you to see something different this time. I want you to see that the figure walking toward the boat is not walking away from the storm. He is not standing safely on the shore, calling the disciples to come to him through calm water. He is in the middle of it with them. He is walking through the very conditions that are terrifying them, toward them, specifically for them. He is walking toward the ones who are afraid. That is the image that I think contains the deepest truth in this entire story.
Not the miracle of physics,
not the water walking, not even the rescue of Peter, as powerful as that is. The deepest truth is this: when the disciples were at their most terrified, their most exhausted, their most desperate and windswept and waterlogged, Jesus was on his way to them. He had been watching from the hill. He knew where they were. He knew what they were going through. And he came to them through the storm, not around it. That is who I is in this story, not the one who makes the storm stop before entering the situation, not the one who rescues you from safe harbor, the one who comes to you in the middle of it, the one who walks across what should be impossible, through what should be impassable, to reach you. And when he gets there, he reaches out his hand. There is a tradition among some Christians of keeping a journal of the storms they have survived, not as a catalog of suffering, but as a record of rescue. A running account of the times when the wind was too strong and the water rose too high, and someone caught them before they went under. If you have such a list, even if it lives only in memory, even if you've never written it down, I want to invite you right now to revisit it. Think of the storm you were sure would destroy you. Think of the moment you were most afraid, most exhausted, most certain that you were going under and no hand was coming. And think of how you are here, right now, on the other shore. You made it across. Maybe you walked on water for a while. Maybe you sank more than once. Maybe someone had to drag you into the boat. Maybe the crossing took years instead of one desperate night. But you are on the other shore, and the one who walked through the storm to reach the disciples on the Sea of Galilee is the same one who has been walking toward you in every storm of your life. Saying the same thing he said then. Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. These are not just words from an ancient text. They are words spoken across every dark water, every impossible night, every storm that has ever threatened to swallow a human soul. They are for you. And if you doubt, if the wind is strong and the water is rising, and the if is louder than the come tonight, then let Peter's cry be your prayer. 3 words, Lord, save me. That is enough. It has always been enough. Thank you for walking through this story with us today. If this touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own storms and your own moments of sinking and being caught, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your testimony, your questions. This community exists to walk through these stories together because none of us were meant to face the water. Subscribe to this channel and come back for the next story, because the Bible is full of moments like this one. Moments where ordinary, frightened, doubting, passionate human beings encounter something so far beyond themselves that the only possible response is worship. We'll see you on the water.